All right. So it's 10:02 Pacific time. My name is Carl Salazar. I'm a solutions engineer here at Sumo Logic. Alongside with me is Matt Snatowski, who's also a solutions engineer here at Sumo Logic. And we're happy to present to you guys about Sumo Logic's Kubernetes solution. So today, May 12th, and we'll go through a couple things in this webinar today. So in our agenda, we will show you a troubleshooting scenario that'll allow you to troubleshoot your Kubernetes clusters, whether it's EKS, GKE, maybe you have a self-managed cluster with kops. Then we'll go through a couple things like searching, parsing, how to create a dashboard potentially, and then show you guys our app catalogs. We have a lot of great partnerships within the Kubernetes community. You'll see that we integrate with a lot of things within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation for the likes of FluentD, FluentBit, things like Prometheus, but also other vendors like StackRox, Aqua, Twistlock. And then we'll talk about how we actually collect the data and send that all to Sumo Logic and how all the piping and mechanics actually works behind the scenes. And then finally, we'll go through some additional resources as well as Q&A. But feel free to ask some questions through the Q&A panel here at the top. Matt will be happy to answer questions live, and then we'll also spend a couple minutes there at the end to answer some live Q&A if we have some additional time. So without further ado, let's actually hop into the platform itself before we actually talk about some additional things and show you how we can actually help you guys manage and troubleshoot your Kubernetes clusters here. So here you can actually see that I have this new Explore tab that Sumo Logic has recently rolled out. And what this Explore tab actually allows you to do is get a high-level overview around the different types of metrics as well as logs for all your Kubernetes clusters. On this left-hand side, you can see we actually have one cluster here called prod01, travellogic.info. But if we had multiple types of clusters, you'd see we had multiple clusters here. Under this hierarchy, we are currently in a deployment view, but we also have several other views to navigate your cluster very easily. So if you wanted to look in a traditional node view, or you want to see things running on a particular node, here I can click on this node view. And if I expand my cluster, you can see my cluster contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different nodes and the host names of these particular nodes. As I drill down into the nodes themselves, you can actually see that our dashboards on the right-hand side actually reflect what level in this Explore tab you're actually in. So here, now I'm on the node view, I can look at the particular metrics for this particular node. And then also the associated pods and then containers under those pods. But let's go back to a deployment view, because I think this is what a lot of people are very interested in. So if I look at this deployment view, I can see all the different deployments that are actually in a particular namespace. Sumo Logic deploys all its collection under the Sumo Logic namespace. So you can see the different things that we actually need to be able to collect logs, metrics, events from your clusters with FluentD, Prometheus, et cetera. So if I go back to this cluster overview, not only do you have this high-level cluster overview where you can see average CPU, memory, disk, different errors that are happening across the namespace, the current status of your particular pods. So here we have all our kube system pods in this prod login namespace. It's something concerning because we see some red honeycombs here. So red typically means down. In this case, I can actually hover over this particular pod, and you can see that this is related to a carbon black pod that looks like it's in a down state. And you can see there's actually a trend chart here in this tooltip to be able to quickly get the trend of, hey, what's going on with this pod? Did it recently happen? You can see it looks like it's consistently trying to restart here potentially. And we'll drill down into this pod to further see how we can troubleshoot that. But let's go into a couple different things before I actually drill down to that prod login namespace. You can see that we also have some additional statistics down below where now you can see trends over time instead of just at the moment, in that in-moment metric, like you're seeing here, where it's showing you the most recent metric. So we can see the different trend charts of CPU, same thing with the total number of nodes, memory percentage over time. And all these different panels and dashboards that you're seeing here are actually out of the box with our application for Kubernetes. So this application gives all of this out of the box, and we also have one specific to GKE, EKS, to self-managed cluster to get some insights into the control planes as well. Not only do you have a cluster overview, but you can look at different types of dashboards. Like if I look at a cluster explorer dashboard, you can see a node-specific view, particularly here in this dashboard, where I can see the memory utilization per node, the CPU utilization per node, and honeycomb formats to make it really easy to identify if one node is having a problem over others. Everything you see here is also customizable, making it really easy to utilize as a template, or you can even create alerts on any of these metrics that you see here. So let's go into that troubleshooting scenario real quick here. So if I go back to my cluster overview, I saw this one pod that I actually wanted to start to troubleshoot here. So if I actually click on this pod, a panel on this right-hand side pops up with some actions that you can take for drill down purposes. So here I can actually look at all the logs for this. So if I click on all the logs, you can see here that it opens up a log search for you for this carbon black pod. So instead of your traditional, maybe you're doing troubleshooting through command line and having to write kubectl commands and do a kubectl, get pods, then you have to copy the pod, then you have to do a kubectl logs. Maybe you had to go in Prometheus and make sure you get that, see the metrics for that particular pod. Everything's all in one place within Sumo. So now I can actually see all the logs here readily available to be able to see what's going on with this carbon black pod. But in this case, we actually don't want to look at the logs, but we actually want to go back here and then go to our choices of drill downs. And let's go into this related explore tab, where now if I click on this pod here, this left-hand side actually updates into the particular point in the hierarchy for me to look at this carbon black pod. And now my dashboard on this right-hand side also reflects just this one carbon black pod particularly. So here you can see that it's actually in a crash loop backoff. It's constantly restarting. And we're also bringing in the events from Kubernetes. So if you do a kubectl describe pod for this carbon black pod, you'll see the events here at the bottom. You can see that, hey, it looks like it's back off, restarting failed container. So constantly failing, a couple different metrics showing us that. But it looks like we don't have any memory or CPU problems from an aggregate perspective. And within this pod state, you can actually see that over the last 60 minutes, it looks like it's actually constantly flapping. So here, this metric is always in a crash loop backoff, constantly in a crash loop backoff. Sometimes it goes into this ready state, and then shortly after, you actually see it go back into this crash loop backoff. And the reason is out of memory killed. So OOM is out of memory killed, but we didn't have a memory problem. So let's continue scrolling down. Maybe you can see the trend chart of what's going on here. And actually, this right chart here shows you the memory usage versus limits versus requests. So we can actually see how much memory we've allocated to this particular pod, and then what the usage is in relation to that allocation. So you can see here that, hey, it looks like it's actually spiking beyond the allocated memory. So no wonder why Kubernetes is saying, hey, go kill this pod. It's using too much memory. So now we've actually determined, hey, this pod needs to be allocated more memory so it can start and get out of this continuous crash loop back off. And then if it wasn't a memory issue, you could also continue to drill down and see, was it a disk issue? Is there network problems? And get some more additional information in this particular pod. So that's how you utilize our Explore tab here to troubleshoot a particular issue. In this case, our carbon black had memory issues. And we drilled down from the Explore cluster overview into the pod itself, able to click on this honeycomb, see it was in a failed state. We drilled down into the pod itself for this Explore tab to identify that there was a memory issue. So let's take a step back. So there's a lot of different types of metrics in here, and it may be, you guys may think it's a whole lot of work to be able to do so, to be able to pull all this data into Sumo Logic, but it really isn't. So let's go back to our slides real quick, just talk about a couple of things here and why we've chosen to do some some things within this Explore tab. Let me go back into present mode here. So the differentiator between Sumo Logic, or why we actually chose to build this Explore tab, is because traditionally you have this infrastructure-centric viewpoint where you're looking at the different services potentially on all these individual nodes. Maybe you're looking at all the individual nodes, like I showed you with that node view. But really, we want to centralize on the service. So that deployment view allows you to look at just a particular deployment. In that case, maybe we were just looking at a Carbon Black deployment or a PagerDuty deployment, which is all log generation for us to be able to power our demo environments. So here you have a payment service. You want to be able to look at everything within the payment service or the user service or the map service. So making easier and simple to understand, quickly find and troubleshoot issues from a service-centric or an application standpoint. And then really it just helps everybody. Maybe you're not even super familiar with your infrastructure, but you know that you support applications or you're a support person. Make it really easy to understand what you're looking at and where in the infrastructure that application or service actually lies. And how do we bring in this data? So data collection in Sumo Logic is actually really easy. So I alluded to some of the collection methodologies a little bit before, but here is a great diagram for you guys to understand exactly how we actually collect the information into Sumo. So like I was mentioning, we collect logs, metrics, events, as well as security events, and push that all into Sumo Logic. And the collection is done through open source de facto tooling that is supported by the CNCF, so the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Here, we actually use FluentBit, which is a lightweight daemon set to be able to collect all the logs running on all the individual nodes on your cluster. And then with FluentD, we collect the events. So when you saw those back off restarting containers events, when we were doing that troubleshooting for the Carbon Black pod, FluentD is actually doing a watch. So we wrote a custom plugin to do a watch on the API server to collect those events. And then all those different types of metrics, we're actually using the Prometheus operator. So utilizing the strengths of Prometheus, where everybody's using Prometheus today, the de facto standard for metrics monitoring with Kubernetes, we just integrate directly with the Prometheus operator. We have an opinionated set of metrics that we actually forward on to Sumo to power those dashboards and make it really easy for you guys to identify issues and look at the things that matter within a cluster. And then from security events perspective, we can actually also utilize Falco out of the box, which has an out-of-the-box rule set that detects for different types of anomalies as well as audit log capabilities within your Kubernetes cluster. All this individual data actually gets centralized into this FluentD pipeline. And what this FluentD pipeline does is it's the one that actually forwards all the individual logs and metrics and events to Sumo Logic. Before it does that, it does data enrichment to apply different metadata to your data. So things like a service, a deployment, a namespace. When we drilled down into the logs there, you saw that all we did was a pod equals Carbon Black, and we were able to identify all the individual logs that are associated with that pod. And the reason we were able to do that is because FluentD does that data enrichment. That way we know what logs are associated, or what the metadata is associated with all your logs. So which pod did it come from, which namespace, which cluster, et cetera, did all those individual logs and metrics come from. And what that allows you to do is make it really easy to do cross-signal correlation from logs to metrics or metrics into logs. All of this is actually packaged up in a single Helm chart, making it really easy to deploy. You can enable or disable particular components in there, but it's as simple as Helm install Sumo Logic and a couple parameters. So I'll pause here and see if there was any questions that anybody may have. Keep in mind, you can utilize the Q&A panel here to send your questions. All right, so moving on, we can actually talk about our partner apps community. So at the top of this call, I also mentioned we did have a lot of different partner apps. So here you can see some of the security partners that we have. And what we do is we integrate with these different technology partners, and we also have apps within our app catalog, so you can quickly get insights into your Twistlock environment, your StackRox, Aqua, JFrog X-Ray, etc. And we provide all these apps right out of the box for you. So anything that you're using in Kubernetes, we probably have an app for. So let's go take a look at our app catalog here. So if I go back to Sumo Logic, you can see on this left-hand side, I can go into our app catalog. And our app catalog consists of a lot of different apps, not only related to Kubernetes, but also in relation to AWS services, maybe utilizing things like RDS as well with your Kubernetes cluster, or maybe you want to take a look at CloudTrail. We have a lot of different AWS services, GCP, we support all the different cloud vendors. But if I click on this Kubernetes one, you can see all the individual apps that we have for all these different types of Kubernetes services or applications. Istio for your service mesh. All these apps are free for you guys to use right out of the box as Sumo Logic customers. So let's go back to the agenda real quick and talk about what we've covered so far. So far, we've covered this troubleshooting scenario. We've talked about the app catalog and collection. So let's go back into Sumo Logic, and we're going to do another scenario. Well, I'll show you how to utilize some search capabilities, some parsing, in a different troubleshooting scenario where we'll go a little bit beyond just looking at our Explore tab there. So if I go back to Sumo Logic, I'm going to go into this Explore tab again, as this will be like my daily news for troubleshooting and getting an up-to-date look at my Kubernetes cluster. So if I go back to this cluster, not only did I see a Carbon Black pod that was in this not ready state, but also I saw this other pod is also in that similar type of state where, hey, it's in a failed state. This is also consistently flapping. As you see a couple of different spikes there for it trying to restart. So I'll do the same type of workflow here, making it really easy and repeatable. I'll drill down into this pod level. You'll see my Explore tab here, updates on this left-hand side. And then now I'm actually looking just at this PagerDuty section here, where my dashboard reflects just this PagerDuty pod. This guy's also in a crash loop backoff, constantly restarting, similar types of failed events for backoff, restarting failed container. It also doesn't have memory or CPU problems, but as I start to scroll down, you can see here this pod state actually is a little bit different than what we showed previously. So here, this is in a crash loop backoff, and then it goes into that ready state, but then we get a different error this time, and it's not out of memory killed, but the reason just says error. So what happens when you just see error? Usually it's something going wrong with the application itself, not allowing the container to actually start up. And we can prove that here because we don't have any problems with our resources. CPU looks fine, memory looks fine. Doesn't look like there's any disk problems not allowing the container to start. So let's actually drill down into the logs themselves like I showed you earlier. So here I can actually click on one of these honeycombs. What I'm actually going to do is look at all the logs associated with this pod. So here we have that metadata associated with all our log messages. So now I'm only looking at these PagerDuty pod messages. We have an easy JSON log that we can parse pretty easily. So I can actually click on this log here. If I wanted to just extract the log, you can see I just right-clicked, parse selected text. Now I actually have this field, or this parse statement that it wrote for me. Actually, I parsed this log message. So now I can look at all the individual logs in an easier format than this JSON. And then if I needed to do some filtering or take a look at all the individual types of messages here, I can do so on this left-hand side. If I wanted to add in some metadata, like the cluster is associated with, you can see that it's associated with this prod 01 TravelLogic cluster. But let's try and figure out what's going on with this particular PagerDuty pod. You can see it actually says it's exiting now, and start to scroll through all the individual log messages. Here we actually see a Java IO exception, but we have 627 different log messages to drill down into or try and take a look That's a decent amount of log messages, not a ton, but I can actually speed up this process. So I can utilize what we call log reduce. And what log reduce will do is we'll group your messages together into what we call a signature and then provide a corresponding count against that signature. So really it tells you how often did a particular type of message actually occur. And here you can see all the different types of messages. Looks like there's a bunch of info level messages. And typically to see things that matter the most, you want to take a look at some of the messages with a low count here. So it looks like there's some, looks like it's reading some values. So it looks like we may have changed some values on some configurations. But if we go back to just the individual messages, we can actually see that, hey, there's those Java IO exceptions. Looks like there's some actual errors here for unable to create a Sumo Logic HTTP post. As we start to scroll down, you can see that, hey, it looks like we have actually changed some different values here. So here we have a final value for category as labs, page duty. As we start to scroll down, we can see we actually changed some access IDs and access keys. So there's a lot of different changes that we're making on this particular pod. And if I take a look at this Java IO exception, you can actually see that we had a status code of 401 here. So 401 meaning unauthorized. So most likely some of these access IDs or API keys were irrelevant. Or not irrelevant, but were unauthorized. So maybe we want to check those and make sure that those are still valid API keys. So this is how you can utilize the different logging tools that we have, whether it's search, if I wanted to just search for a particular exception or just all exceptions, I could do so within Sumo Logic and maybe make it a little bit easier to figure out what is going on here. So here are the different errors. There's the exceptions that we saw. But a whole lot of power beyond just doing simple keyword searches that we can actually drill down into in maybe even an additional webinar, or you can utilize some tools in Sumo Logic to be able to get some additional information if you want to learn more. So back to our agenda here, I think we pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover here, where we did a couple different troubleshooting scenarios, one for our metrics scenario, one drilling down into the logs. We talked about searching, parsing a little bit, our app catalog, as well as collection. So that's pretty much all I had to cover here. And we'll stop here and pause for some Q&A potentially, and some additional information for you guys to get started. If you want to sign up for a trial, you can go to www.sumologic.com/signup. If you want to join us in our public Slack, a lot of engineers like myself are on our public Slack channel. You can reach out to me directly at Carl@Sumo Logic. Also, Matt Santowski, who's my colleague here, is happy to answer some questions as well. All right, so it doesn't look like there's any questions. So thank you guys for attending. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me at in our public Slack channel or carl@sumologic.com. We'll happy to answer any of the questions that you may have. We'll have some follow-ups here. We'll send the recording out to attendees who are unable to make it, as well as a recording for you guys for your reference. So thank you very much for attending, and have a great day.